My first question is, this is a changing context. Can you talk about what you think are the most important changes that leaders and boards and investors are facing in business?
I think it's incredibly important for boards, executives and investors to understand the context in which the enterprise is operating. For example, post the crisis of 2008, we find ourselves in a world of structurally lower macroeconomic growth. That means there's just less money around. People need to be more effective and efficient in how they do business. We know that there are very big demographic shifts, aging populations in the developed world. We know that technology is changing everything, the very rapid evolution of cloud technology, artificial intelligence, natural language, these sorts of things present wonderful opportunities, but also profound challenges for companies and societies. And of course, we see increasing geopolitical volatility around the world.
So if we go on to say, well, what does it mean for people who lead businesses?
I think we're in a very different era today. If you think about the corporation, it's really the creature of the 20th century. And in the early to mid part of the 20th century, corporations could be very planful in how they operated. That was why strategy gained prevalence. That was about planning, identifying your objective, identifying where you are, how you're going to get to achieve your objectives, and then building a machine that could, in a very linear way, deliver those objectives over a 3, 5, 7-year time horizon. In this new world, because of the context changes, corporations are required to be agile. Who knows what's going to happen next week, next month, next year? We can't predict how technology is going to change our world. We can't predict where the next geopolitical hotspot is going to come from. We can understand broadly the context in which we operate, but we can't predict because we don't have a crystal ball. So agility becomes key.
You gave a very interesting example in your talk of a company in which the attempt to do things differently and in a new way was foiled by the old habits without attributing it necessarily. Could you tell us about that example?
In big companies, there tends to be a resistance to the new. So I came across a company that had moved from a waterfall technology development process, which is a very linear process, to one which was an agile process, basically the process of code creation, which gives you much smaller technology releases, but you can constantly iterate the technology capability to deliver better for the end user. But unfortunately for this company, the internal audit department decided that the agile method of development was not consistent with the company's technology policies. Well, of course it wasn't, because it was new. But actually it was creating a much better, lower risk result than the old way of doing things. But of course the organization was programmed to look for the old way of doing things, not the new way of doing things. And so architecting agility into companies is actually very demanding.
What's your vision of how the board is different, both in what it does and the people who we need to sit on it?
Well, firstly, I think boards have to understand two key things, and they have to hold the executive accountable for two key things. One is this notion of context. The old days of strategic planning, I think, are over, but understanding the context points and how those context points interact is critically important. But the other thing is, what capabilities does the organization need to be able to operate in the context? And is the executive building those capabilities at the right pace and with the right qualities attached to them?
You also talked about the paradox that, in a way, everything's happening much faster, and therefore agility implies you're reacting in a much more short-term way. But you were making the point that you're only going to be good at that if you take a very long-term approach. Would you like to sort of explain that paradox a bit more?
Well, if we accept the premise that everything is much more short-term and instantaneous, and that the only real response for that is agility, it takes time to build agility into the organization. You can't just become agile overnight. It requires you to fundamentally retool the way the organization operates. What are the sorts of people that we hire? How do we organize them into work units? What's our culture? Does it support and reward agility? Does it support and reward calculated risk-taking? Not irresponsible behavior, but calculated risk-taking. How do we deal with failure? Do we penalise it, or do we regard it as a learning opportunity? These things take time to build in to an organisation, and it's a process that requires a long-term view. Today's short-term was yesterday's long-term, and organisations need to think about it that way.
You also talked about the kind of 5 aspects that were involved in truly embedding the purpose and the values. Would you just describe those 5 elements?
Yeah, very briefly, all organisations have culture, and I believe that culture is a huge driver of organisational performance. So it's in the interests of boards and executives to manage culture. And there are 5 steps to doing that. The first is the definition of culture, which is perhaps best expressed through a set of values. And oftentimes that's where companies stop. They just put them on some mouse pads or put them in the lobby of the building. But the next thing that has to happen is you have to retool the mechanisms of the organisation. So how do we hire people? How do we train people? How do we develop people? How do we reward people to support the values? Then, of course, you have to implement the values in day-to-day decision making. Does that product and service deliver in a way that's consistent with the values? Have we treated that client in a way that's consistent with the values? When we make a mistake, how do we deal with that? Then the 4th step is you have to measure progress through using survey techniques and so on. Do our colleagues feel committed to the values? Do they feel able to live them? What are the impediments to those things? Are we removing the impediments? Are we being seen to demonstrate that we're living the values? And the 5th thing, and perhaps the most important, is that culture has to be led. And it has to be led in an authentic and relentless way.
You also talked about your own initiative in Barclays. You were determined to set some very clear 5-year goals, and also not simply for shareholder returns, but 5-year goals in terms of the major relationships of the business. Would you talk about that?
Yes, one of the things about agility and capability is you have to have a way to measure whether you're actually delivering the output of those things. So I'm a great believer in having a balanced scorecard that represents the 4 key stakeholder groups: the customer, the employee, society, and the shareholder. Setting, in the case of Barclays, 2 goals against each, and then defining a time horizon, in the case of Barclays 2018, setting targets with metrics against those goals, and then measuring progress and reporting on them as the same way you report on your financial results, and actually having them audited with the same degree of rigor that you would audit your financial results. And that is a mechanism by which you can build long-term sustainability into the business.
And if you have a message for the institutional investor community, the fund managers and the asset owners who give them their mandates, what would that message be?
I think it is in the investors' interests to look for companies that understand context, are building capability, that are articulate about their leadership challenges and how they're using culture to drive organisational performance. Because at the end of the day, those activities are what builds long-term shareholder value.
Can you say anything about the new Tomorrow's Company report, UK Business, what's wrong and what's next, and your reaction to it?
Well, I agree with large parts of it. I think we've talked a lot about risk aversion, for example. The thing about risk is, and we can talk a lot about how the brain works and brain chemistry and the amygdala and so on, but basically we're programmed to be risk averse. And of course, in this very volatile environment where agility is required, actually that's the worst thing you can do. It's the most risky thing. You've got to be able to embrace agility and take the risk that goes along with it, because that risk is much less than the risk of staying the way you are and just promulgating the status quo. So I'm a huge supporter of the report, and I think there's a lot of insight within it.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to our thinking about where governance and stewardship and leadership needs to go next. Thank you.
Thank you.